On July 6, 2026, in a convention hall in Geneva, representatives of 193 nations take their seats for the first time to negotiate one subject: artificial intelligence. Ask yourself who actually holds the pen in that room. The flags say, every nation has a voice. The compute says otherwise. By some counts, two countries control somewhere near 90% of the machines the summit is arguing about. That imbalance, not the agenda printed on paper, is the real story opening in Geneva this month. This is the United Nations' newest attempt at global AI governance. And for the first time, membership is universal. Earlier AI summits were curated affairs, run by whichever government sent the invitations, with guest lists that left most of the world watching from outside. Geneva is different. Every United Nations member state holds a guaranteed seat, alongside companies, researchers, and civil society groups who showed up to watch, argue, and occasionally interrupt. Universal membership is not the same as universal power. That tension sits underneath 2 days of speeches, wrapped around an event most viewers outside Geneva will never see footage of. Geneva did not happen in isolation either. The dialogue ran the same week as a United Nations Technology Forum and a separate AI-focused summit in the same city, turning 1 week into the closest thing global AI diplomacy currently has to a capital. That concentration of attention is itself a signal. Nobody wants to be the government or company that skipped the room where the rules might eventually get written. The dialogue traces back to a General Assembly commitment inside the Global Digital Compact, and it is co-chaired not by a major power, but by ambassadors from El Salvador and Estonia. A deliberate signal that this forum belongs to the many, not only to the few who already dominate the compute layer. Delegates organize their 2 days around 4 themes: what AI actually offers and threatens, how to close the gap between countries with AI infrastructure and countries without it, what makes a system safe enough to trust, and how to keep humans, not algorithms, accountable for outcomes. 4 themes, 0 binding text attached to any of them. So what did Geneva actually settle? A co-chair and a guest list do not settle who writes the rules. The dialogue's own design produces a summary of the discussion, not a treaty. Nobody leaves Geneva bound to anything. What delegates leave with instead is a set of open questions: whether a voluntary framework can restrain systems moving faster than any technology regulators have tried to govern before, whether nations without compute can audit the nations that have it, and whether the United Nations' own scientists think any of this is even technically possible to guarantee in the first place. That last question was supposed to have an answer before the delegates walked in. 5 days before the summit opened, the United Nations Independent International Scientific Panel on AI published its answer. The panel is new. 40 members, appointed February 12, 2026, selected from more than 2,600 applications spanning over 140 countries, chosen to serve in a personal capacity rather than as government envoys. Yoshua Bengio and Maria Ressa co-chair it after the panel's inaugural meeting on March 3, 2026. Its mandate is deliberately narrow: assess evidence, not prescribe policy, and report annually rather than issue a single verdict. Its preliminary report, released July 1, 2026, delivered one finding that reframes everything discussed in Geneva. There is currently no known technical guarantee that AI agent systems will follow their instructions consistently. Put plainly, science cannot promise that increasingly capable systems will not cause serious harm. That is not a prediction. It is an admission of a gap nobody has closed. The finding did not describe some future system. It described the same agent-based tools governments were, at that moment, trying to regulate without a clear way to look under the hood. What good is a summit built on evidence nobody can fully verify? None of it was softened for a diplomatic audience. The panel stated the limitation and left the response to the politicians, exactly what its founding mandate asked it to do. 40 scientists handed 193 governments a problem statement instead of a solution, on purpose. Then came the agenda. Secretary General António Guterres said on opening day. In his July 6, 2026, remarks, he named 4 priorities for any AI governance framework: common safety standards, human rights red lines, capacity building support for developing countries, and environmental transparency around AI's energy footprint. He called autonomous weapons systems morally repugnant and pushed governments to adopt a child safety pledge specific to AI products, framing children's safety as a test case for whether the broader framework could work at all. 4 priorities from the Secretary General. Zero enforcement mechanism attached to any of them. Who, exactly, enforces any of it? That gap between naming a problem and giving anyone authority to act on it is the actual subject here. It is also why the scientific panel mattered more than the speeches. A panel of 40 people, drawn from an applicant pool larger than the population of several United Nations member states, was not assembled to hand politicians comfort. It was assembled to hand them a baseline, whether or not that baseline was convenient going into a week of negotiation. What Geneva's delegates argued about for 2 days sat directly on top of a report telling them nobody can currently guarantee the systems they are regulating will behave as instructed. That baseline does not resolve the politics, and it was never designed to. It just removes the excuse for ignoring the uncertainty while writing the rules anyway. Zoom out from the summit floor and 3 numbers explain more than any speech did. Start with the capability race everyone assumes still favors the United States. Stanford's 2026 AI Index measured the performance gap between the best American and the best Chinese AI models at just 2.7% as of March 2026. In May 2023, that same gap ran between 17.5 and 31.6 percentage points. The convergence happened even though the same index tracked American private AI investment at $285.9 billion against China's $12.4 billion. A spending gap of roughly 23 to 1. Money bought a shrinking lead, not growth. Here is the detail that should unsettle both delegations equally. Convergence like this usually predicts a race, not a truce. Then there's the United Nations' own institutional pace to weigh. A temporary United Nations advisory body studied AI governance from 2023 to 2024, then recommended a permanent replacement. That replacement, the Independent Scientific Panel, was seated in 2026. 2 years in United Nations time is close to fast-tracked. The institution treats this file differently than most technical ones, which suggests the United Nations itself does not view this as a routine regulatory exercise. The number that actually answers the question this story opened with, though, is compute concentration. Stanford's 2026 index puts the United States at roughly 75% of the world's top AI supercomputing capacity, China at roughly 15%. The remaining 191 nations that sat in Geneva split whatever is left, a fraction too thin to independently test a single claim made at the podium. In a June 2025 analysis, researchers at Oxford's Internet Institute gave this dynamic a name: compute sovereignty. The idea that owning the physical infrastructure underneath a technology matters more than owning a seat at the table where it gets discussed. Their work breaks the concept into layers: how much compute sits inside a country's borders, which companies own the data centers, and which countries manufacture the chips inside them. By nearly every layer, the same handful of countries keep showing up at the top. Auditing a frontier AI system without independent compute access is close to impossible. Most of the room could debate the rules. Almost none of it could verify compliance with them. What is a rule nobody can check? That is the answer to who holds the pen. It was never the 193 flags. None of this makes Geneva theater, and none of it makes Geneva a treaty. Both readings oversimplify what a first-of-its-kind, non-binding dialogue can do. Is a summary worth the journey for 193 delegations? The answer depends on what happens after May 2027, when the second dialogue convenes in New York. Skeptics note voluntary frameworks have a mixed record. Climate diplomacy took decades between its first dialogue and its first binding commitment, and AI is moving on a timeline measured in product releases, not years. Supporters counter that universal membership is itself the achievement. Every prior AI summit, run by a single host government, produced commitments only the invited nations felt bound by. Geneva's forum, whatever it ultimately produces, carries the weight of every United Nations member state having been in the room for its opening. Both claims are defensible, and they are not fully reconcilable yet. The Independent Scientific Panel was explicit that its report offers evidence, not prescriptions, a deliberate choice to keep the science separated from the politics. even though the politics is what determines whether the science gets acted on. There is a quieter asymmetry worth naming. The two ambassadors chairing the dialogue represent nations with almost no frontier compute, running a process meant to govern the two nations that have nearly all of it. Whether that arrangement produces genuine bargaining power for smaller states, or simply gives the imbalance a friendlier face, is not something 2 days could settle either way. A third player sits outside the flags entirely. Bloomberg's Gautam Mukunda noted in June 2026 that recent gatherings of world leaders now seat AI company executives beside heads of state, treated less like vendors than peers. Geneva's power struggle was never a clean two-country contest. It runs through boardrooms that answer to shareholders, not electorates. What is not in dispute is the compute imbalance itself, drawn from the same index both American and Chinese officials cite when it suits them. What remains genuinely unresolved is whether a body with no enforcement power can shift that imbalance, or whether Geneva simply gave the imbalance its first formal hearing. A pledge is not a rule. A summary is not a treaty. Geneva produced both, and mistook neither for the other. Back in that Geneva hall, the 193 flags never lied. They just never told the whole story. The room that opened on July 6th agreed to keep talking, not to keep score, and scheduled its next conversation for New York, 10 months out, leaving the compute gap exactly where the scientists found it, unresolved, unaudited, and unaffected by 2 days of speeches. Nothing in Geneva was binding. Nothing in Geneva was nothing either. The real test of global AI governance was not settled in Geneva. It was scheduled. Facts over fear.